They say that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. No one wanted that slogan to be true more than Jean Huden did. Especially since Vegas was where her husband had told her he intended to kill a complete stranger. He wanted to know what it would feel like to kill someone.
Somebody, yes.
Nobody's ever said that to me before.
Yeah, me either.
But this was not to be a thrill killing. According to Jean, her husband believed murdering the victim he had in mind would be a kind of public service.
He just said he beat his children and beat his wife and didn't take care of his family and just an abusive...
Made him sound exactly like the guy that Jim had grown up with.
Exactly.
What did Jim say he was going to do?
Well, he said that Peggy's friend Brenna had approached him and that she would share the insurance money with him.
Murder for hire?
Yes.
Did you try to talk him out of this?
I did. I thought he was just talking. I was just hoping he would get over it.
It had been a tough year for Mr. and Mrs. Huden. The death of a childhood friend had sent Jim Huden spinning off into a Hall of Fame-worthy midlife crisis that ran the gamut from alcoholism and adultery to vague notions of murder.
I just didn't think he would follow through with it. I mean, he didn't even know how to shoot a gun.
By Christmas 2003, things seemed to have hit rock bottom. Instead of returning home with Jean after their romantic reunion in Las Vegas, Jim had stayed out west. Did you think he was with Peggy?
At that point, I thought so, yeah. I mean, I knew what was going on, and I knew it was over, and there was no point in confronting him because he would lie about it anyway.
Abandoned and alone, Jean spent the holidays waiting for word from Jim. Then, in early January, Jean says her phone rang. Her husband was on the line. But Jim Huden wasn't calling to wish his wife a Happy New Year. According to Jean, he was calling to tell her that dreams do come true. He had killed a man in cold blood.
He just said it was done, and he's coming back.
The murder?
Yes.
What'd you say?
I think I was speechless at the time. I think I asked if he was okay, and does anyone know, or are they after you, or I basically asked if he was okay.
Your husband had just confessed that he had committed a murder for hire.
Mm-hmm. It was like getting kicked in the stomach. I knew life as I knew it was over at that point.
Jean says her husband drove through the night, pulling into their garage in Punta Gorda after dark the next day.
He basically told me how they had lured Russell to a certain spot on the island and how he came out of some bushes and walked up to him and just shot him in the head. And he made it sound like, it was kind of gentle and peaceful, and then, his head just tilted over and he walked away.
Jim had told you that he had this dark secret, that he wanted to know what it would be like to kill someone.
Right.
Did it live up to his expectations?
Well, at first he said for a few days he felt like a big man, and it was exhilarating, and he thought he had accomplished something and rid the world of someone who didn't need to be there anymore. But then it started to close in on him, and then he wasn't such a big man, and that he knew he had made a terrible mistake.
Based on what Jim told you, did Brenna Douglas offer any shred of proof that her husband was abusive, or did Jim just kind of commit that murder pretty much on faith?
Pretty much on faith, as far as I knew, because I've come to find out later there were no records of him, there were no reports of domestic abuse as far as I understand. After laying low for a while, Jean says, Jim gradually started picking up the pieces of his old life in Punta Gorda. As the weeks passed, Jean says she even allowed herself to think that perhaps the ugliness of the past 2 years was in the past. That is, until the April day when a tall, red-headed stranger appeared on her doorstep. Jim was doing a local radio show here in the morning, and I was at home, and there's a knock on the door, and I open the door, and it's Peggy Thomas standing on my doorstep. In that icy instant, Jim Huden's complicated double life collapsed. As the women talked, Jean says, it became clear that both had been lied to. Both believed Jim was done with the other and committed to them. He was playing us both for quite some time, trying to keep us both apart from each other.
So there you are with Peggy, and Jim's not there. Mm-hmm. For how long?
Not long, because I called the radio station and suggested he get home real fast. He stopped the show and came home, and Peggy and I are sitting there on the couch.
How did he look?
Not good.
So what happens at that meeting?
There was a lot of yelling.
The two of you yelling at Jim or at each other?
A little of both. I mean, I was yelling at her because she knew he was married.
And she's saying, what, I was led to believe that there's nothing left of your marriage
Right,
anymore.
it was like a knife in the heart. It was. And at that point, he needed to make a choice. And he said he was going to stay with me.
Although Jean says Peggy agreed to leave them in peace and return to Las Vegas, a few weeks later she was back, this time showing up unannounced at a reunion gig for Jim's old band, Buck Naked and the Exhibitionists. Bill Hill says the moment he saw her face in the audience, he knew it was trouble. Trouble because shortly after returning to Punta Gorda, Jim Huden had told him that Peggy had helped Jim murder a man who reminded Jim of someone he'd known as a child, a man who'd allegedly beaten and abused Jim's mother.
He says, I would have done him in if he was still alive. And he says, I found a person that met his description as far as abusiveness. And I says, yeah. And he says, well, I shot him in the head and killed him.
No chance that he was kidding or not telling the truth.
I knew he was telling the truth. He says Peggy found a person that supposedly was abusive, and it happened to be the husband of a woman that owned the hair salon in Whidbey Island, I believe.
Where Peggy worked.
Where Peggy worked, yes.
So Peggy knew all about this.
She helped him.
For 5 months, Bill Hill says he struggled under the weight of that confession. Then, in late July 2004, his conscience finally got the better of him.
I decided to make my first call.
Your first call?
To Whidbey Island.
To the police?
Yes, to the island county sheriffs. Felt guilty I was giving up my friend, but I knew something had to be done.
Within days of that call, detectives Mark Plumberg and Mike Beach were sitting face to face with both their tipster, Bill Hill, and their suspect, the artist formerly known as Buck Naked.
Coming up, the interrogation gets tough.
You know what you've told Bill. The guy's falling apart over the guilt he's carrying around because you told him what you did.
Will Jim crack, or will detectives realize they've got the wrong man?